Hey there! Tonight, we're stepping into a world of whispered promises and rigid propriety. Not the romantic fairy tale you've seen in costume dramas, but the real, complex, often suffocating truth of Victorian courtship. You won't find instant chemistry here or passionate declarations in moonlit gardens. Just a life built on rules, reputation, chaperoning, and the constant navigation between desire and duty. If these glimpses into the past help you drift into dreams, you can like and subscribe, but only if they truly calm your mind. And if you'd like to help our peaceful historical channel grow, your support means more than you imagine. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, the time on your clock, and if you still have a little sleepy curiosity remaining, send it our way. It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the same careful dance through history. So, dim the lights. Let your imagination fill a grand ballroom with nervous debutantes and calculating mothers. Settle in, and let's begin with what Victorian dating was really like. Picture London in the year 1855. The air smells of coal smoke and horse manure. Gas lamps flicker on street corners. And somewhere in a grand townhouse in Mayfair, a young woman of 17 stands before a mirror while her lady's maid tightens her corset strings until breathing becomes a calculated effort. Tonight is her debut ball. Tonight, her life as a marriageable commodity officially begins. She has spent years preparing for this moment. Not preparing to fall in love, mind you, but preparing to be examined, evaluated, and, if fortune smiles, selected by a suitable gentleman with adequate means and proper connections. This is not a love story. This is a business transaction wrapped in silk and presented with a curtsy. The Victorian era, spanning from 1837, when Queen Victoria ascended the throne, until her death in 1901, lasted 64 years. That's more than 6 decades of rigid social codes, elaborate rituals, and suffocating expectations around courtship and marriage. And while we often think of Victorians as prudish, repressed, and obsessed with propriety, which they absolutely were, the reality of how young people actually navigated romance during this period was far more complex, contradictory, and frankly exhausting than most people realize. Because beneath all those layers of respectability and restraint was a churning undercurrent of desire, strategy, desperation, and occasionally genuine affection fighting to express itself within impossibly narrow confines. To understand Victorian dating, you first have to understand that for the vast majority of this era, there was no such thing as dating, not in any sense we would recognize today. There were no coffee dates, no casual meetups, no getting to know someone over a series of relaxed encounters. Instead, there was courtship, a formal, regulated, heavily supervised process with a singular goal: marriage. And not just any marriage, but a marriage that maintained or improved one's social standing, secured financial stability, and met with family approval. Love, if it happened to develop along the way, was considered a pleasant bonus, but it was never the primary objective. The primary objective was survival, security, and status. This meant that from the moment a young woman was considered old enough to marry, typically around 18, but sometimes as young as 16 for the upper classes, her entire existence became focused on attracting the right kind of attention from the right kind of gentleman. Every social interaction was choreographed. Every conversation was monitored. Every gesture, glance, and word was analyzed for propriety. Because one misstep, one moment of indiscretion, one hint of impropriety could destroy not just her prospects, but her family's reputation. The stakes were impossibly high. The rules were impossibly strict. And yet somehow, young people still managed to fall in love, rebel against expectations, and carve out tiny moments of genuine connection in a world determined to keep them apart, until a contract was signed and a ring was exchanged. What made Victorian courtship particularly challenging was the sheer number of written and unwritten rules governing every interaction between unmarried men and women. There were rules about where you could meet, when you could speak, how long you could look at each other, what topics were acceptable for conversation, what gifts could be exchanged, how close you could stand, and, absolutely under no circumstances, whether you could ever be alone together. These rules weren't suggestions. They were social laws, enforced not by police, but by something far more powerful: the watchful eyes of mothers, chaperones, servants, neighbors, and society at large. Everyone was watching, everyone was judging, and everyone was ready to whisper about the slightest deviation from proper behavior. But rules, as we know, were made to be tested. And while most young Victorians played by the official guidelines, at least publicly, many also became masters at finding loopholes, exploiting technicalities, and developing secret languages that allowed them to communicate feelings that polite society forbade them from expressing directly. They spoke through fans. They sent messages via flower arrangements. They passed clandestine notes disguised as dance cards. They learned to say everything with their eyes that their lips were forbidden to utter. Victorian courtship may have been rigid and formal on the surface, but underneath it was a constant game of strategy, subversion, and barely contained longing. The marriage market, and that's what it was called, the marriage mart, operated with all the subtlety of a livestock auction. Though, of course, everyone pretended it was about romance and refinement. For upper and upper middle class families, the process began when a young woman came out into society, a phrase that sounds far more liberating than the reality. Coming out didn't mean freedom. It meant being presented, displayed, and made available for inspection by potential suitors and their families. The formal presentation to society happened differently depending on your social rank. For the aristocracy and wealthiest families, it meant being presented at court to Queen Victoria herself, a nerve-wracking ceremony that required months of preparation. The perfect dress, which had to meet specific requirements, including a train of specific length, and hours of practicing the complex curtsy that one was expected to perform without wobbling or fainting. The Queen would barely glance at you. You would back out of her presence, and then you were officially out, which meant officially available for marriage proposals. For middle-class families who couldn't access court presentations, coming out was a quieter affair, but no less significant. It usually meant starting to attend adult social functions, putting up your hair in a more mature style, lowering your hemlines to full length, joining your mother for social calls, and generally being seen at church, at concerts, at respectable gatherings where eligible young men might also be present. The goal was visibility within your social sphere, making sure that families with marriageable sons knew that the Smith girl or the Brown girl was now old enough to be considered. The London season, which ran roughly from May through August, was the apex of the marriage market for those who could afford to participate. Families with daughters to marry would take up residence in London townhouses, attend a relentless schedule of balls, dinner parties, concerts, and social calls, all designed to maximize exposure to potential suitors. This wasn't a vacation. This was work. Expensive, exhausting work. Mothers acted as strategic managers, identifying promising candidates, engineering introductions, promoting their daughters' accomplishments, and carefully monitoring every interaction to ensure nothing inappropriate occurred. The balls themselves were elaborate productions. Young women would arrive with their mothers or chaperones wearing their finest gowns, their hands protected by gloves that would not be removed all evening. A dance card hung from their wrists, a small booklet listing the evening's dances, with spaces where gentlemen could write their names to reserve a dance. But here's where it got tricky. A gentleman couldn't simply walk up and ask for a dance. He had to be properly introduced first, usually by a mutual acquaintance or the host of the ball. And once introduced, he still had to observe strict protocols. During the dance itself, conversation was permitted but carefully circumscribed. Topics had to be light, neutral, and utterly impersonal. The weather was always safe. Music was acceptable. Books might be discussed if they were suitably proper. But anything remotely intimate, any questions about feelings or hopes or dreams would be wildly inappropriate. And here's a detail that would shock modern sensibilities. After dancing with a gentleman at a ball, a young woman was not permitted to speak to him again that evening outside of the dance floor unless they happened to meet in a public space with others present. Two young people who had just danced together, who might have felt a spark of connection, could not pursue a conversation, could not seek each other out, could not sit together. They had to wait for another proper introduction at another event, or hope that the gentleman would make a formal call at her home. The calling system was its own elaborate ritual. If a gentleman was interested in pursuing acquaintance with a young lady after meeting her at a social event, he could pay a call at her family's home during designated calling hours, typically in the afternoon. But he couldn't just show up. He had to leave his calling card first, a small printed card with his name, and wait to see if it was returned, indicating that a call would be welcome. If the family welcomed his attention, he would be admitted into the drawing room, where he would never, under any circumstances, be left alone with the young lady. Her mother, or an aunt, or a sister, or a companion would always be present, seated nearby, ostensibly occupied with needlework or reading, but actually monitoring every word exchanged. These calls were brief, usually 15 to 20 minutes, and rigidly formal. The gentleman would sit at a proper distance. He would make polite conversation.
He would demonstrate his manners, his education, and his suitability. The young woman would pour tea with graceful competence, respond with appropriate modesty, and reveal absolutely nothing of her true personality, lest it be judged improper. Both parties were performing roles, reading from a script that society had written long before they were born. Authenticity was not valued. Conformity was everything. If the calls continued, if the gentleman's attentions persisted, if the family approved of his character and prospects, the courtship might progress to slightly more varied activities. Walks in the park, always chaperoned, attendance at the same church services, invitations to family dinners or small gatherings, but every activity was public, supervised, and conducted within the rigid boundaries of propriety. The couple was getting to know each other, yes, but only the carefully edited, socially acceptable versions of themselves. They were meeting not as full human beings with flaws and quirks and private thoughts, but as representatives of their families, their class, and their gender expectations.
For many young women, the season was a kind of endurance test. Those who secured an engagement early were considered fortunate, not because they'd found love, but because they'd successfully completed their mission and could stop the exhausting performance. Those who finished a season without a proposal faced the prospect of returning the following year, and the year after that, each successive season making them seem less desirable, more desperate, closer to the dreaded fate of becoming an old maid. By the time a woman reached her mid-20s without marrying, she was often considered past her prime, though men could marry much later without any social stigma attached. The pressure on young women during the season was immense. Families had spent enormous sums on clothing, accommodations, and social expenses. Mothers had invested time and energy in preparation. Younger sisters waited in the wings, unable to come out until their older sister had married. The weight of family expectations, financial considerations, and social judgment bore down on these young women, many of whom were still teenagers, forcing them to smile through balls, charm through calls, and present themselves as perpetually pleasant, accomplished, and agreeable. The ones who succeeded often married men they barely knew. The ones who failed carried the shame of rejection and the anxiety of uncertain futures. Victorian courtship looked dramatically different depending on which rung of the social ladder you occupied. The elaborate rituals of the season, the presentations at court, the endless balls and social calls, these were the privileges and burdens of the upper and upper middle classes. For everyone else, courtship followed different patterns, operated under different pressures, and came with its own unique challenges and restrictions. The middle classes, that vast and varied section of Victorian society that included everyone from prosperous merchants to struggling clerks, couldn't afford the extravagance of the London season, but they desperately wanted to emulate upper-class respectability. Middle-class courtship happened in more modest settings, but still adhered to strict propriety. Young people might meet at church socials, at community concerts, through family friends, or at respectable gatherings in private homes. Chaperones were still required, though they might be a family member rather than a paid companion. Physical contact was still forbidden. Reputation was still everything. What made middle-class courtship particularly challenging was the economic anxiety underlying every romantic decision. A middle-class man was expected to establish himself financially before he could marry. He needed to prove he could support a wife in the manner to which she was accustomed, which meant having a stable position, adequate income, and prospects for advancement. This wasn't about wealth. It was about respectability and security. A clerk earning £30 a year couldn't afford to marry, not if it meant his wife would have to work or they'd have to live in shabby accommodations that would lower their social standing. This economic requirement meant that middle-class courtships were often prolonged affairs. A young couple might become attached, might even reach an understanding that they intended to marry. But the engagement couldn't be formalized until the man's finances were secure. These long courtships, sometimes lasting years, tested patience and fidelity. Young women waited, growing older, watching other friends marry, wondering if the wait would be rewarded, or if their intended would find someone else, or if the financial security they needed would ever materialize. Young men worked desperately to establish themselves, taking on extra responsibilities, saving every penny, anxious about their ability to fulfill expectations. Parents exercised significant control over middle-class courtships. While young people in this era had more say in choosing their partners than previous generations, parents still held considerable influence through what one historian described as the right to be consulted, to advise, and to warn. A father who disapproved of a suitor could make life very difficult, even if he couldn't absolutely forbid the match. Mothers actively managed their daughters' social circles, promoting contact with suitable young men from families they approved of, while discouraging interactions with those they deemed inappropriate. Family approval mattered enormously, because marriage wasn't just joining two individuals, it was joining two families, and maintaining good family relations was essential for social and economic survival. For the working classes, courtship looked entirely different. Young women from working-class families often left home by age 14 to work in factories, shops, or as domestic servants. This meant they had more freedom from parental supervision than their middle-class counterparts, but it also meant they had far less protection and far more vulnerability. A working-class girl employed in a factory might meet young men at work, at church, or during rare hours of leisure. Without mothers hovering behind or drawing rooms to receive callers in, courtship happened in more public spaces and more casual encounters, walks in the park on Sunday afternoon, conversations after church, meetings at community gatherings. But working-class women, particularly those employed as domestic servants, faced unique restrictions. Most households employing servants had strict rules about followers, the term used for suitors who might call on female servants. Many households forbade followers entirely, meaning that a housemaid or kitchen maid had no opportunity to meet young men socially. Others allowed followers only on specific days, perhaps one afternoon a month, and only in designated spaces where the interaction could be monitored. Employers worried that romantic attachments would distract servants from their duties or lead to pregnancy, which would make the servant unmarriable and unemployable. A domestic servant who became pregnant was typically dismissed without references, consigned to poverty or prostitution with no way back to respectable employment. The working classes also had to navigate longer engagements than other social groups, not because of propriety, but because of economics. A working-class couple needed to save enough money to establish their own household, however modest, before they could marry. This might mean years of engagement, years of waiting, years of working and saving and hoping that both parties would remain faithful and that no scandal would intervene. During these long engagements, couples often saw each other rarely, perhaps once a week or even less frequently if they worked in different areas or had demanding schedules. Their relationships developed through letters, through patience, and through faith that the future they were working toward would eventually arrive. Working-class women also had to contend with more direct sexual pressure than women from higher social classes. Without chaperones constantly present, without the protective barrier of elaborate social rituals, working-class women navigating courtship had to manage unwanted advances, pressure to prove affection physically, and the constant risk that a moment of yielding would result in pregnancy and ruin. The sexual double standard applied at all social levels, but for working-class women, the consequences of sexual transgression were even more severe. An upper-class woman who became pregnant outside marriage might be sent away to have the baby quietly and then return to society with her reputation bruised but potentially salvageable. A working-class woman in the same situation faced complete social and economic destruction with no safety net. Some working-class individuals, particularly in urban areas, turn to matrimonial advertisements as a way to find partners outside their immediate social circles. These advertisements, published in periodicals and newspapers, were the Victorian equivalent of dating apps. Men and women would place ads describing themselves and what they sought in a partner. A typical ad might read, "Respectable young woman, 23, good needlewoman, seeks acquaintance of steady young man." The working classes also had to navigate longer engagements than other social groups, not because of propriety, but because of economics. A working-class couple needed to save enough money to establish their own household, however modest, before they could marry. This might mean years of engagement, years of waiting, years of working and saving, and hoping that both parties would remain faithful and that no scandal would intervene. During these long engagements, couples often saw each other rarely, perhaps once a week, or even less frequently if they worked in different areas or had demanding schedules. Their relationships developed through letters, through patience, and through faith that the future they were working toward would eventually arrive. Working-class women also had to contend with more direct sexual pressure than women from higher social classes. Without chaperones constantly present, without the protective barrier of elaborate social rituals, working-class women navigating courtship had to manage unwanted advances, pressure to prove affection physically, and the constant risk that a moment of yielding would result in pregnancy and ruin. The sexual double standard applied at all social levels, but for working-class women, the consequences of sexual transgression were even more severe. An upper-class woman who became pregnant outside marriage might be sent away to have the baby quietly and then return to society with her reputation bruised but potentially salvageable. A working-class woman in the same situation faced complete social and economic destruction with no safety net. Some working-class individuals, particularly in urban areas, turned to matrimonial advertisements as a way to find partners outside their immediate social circles. These advertisements, published in periodicals and newspapers, were the Victorian equivalent of dating apps. Men and women would place ads describing themselves and what they sought in a partner. A typical ad might read, "Respectable young woman, 23, good needlewoman, seeks acquaintance of steady young man with view to matrimony." Or, "Clerk, 28, regular church attender, modest means but good prospects, desires correspondence with suitable young lady of quiet disposition." These ads came with social stigma, particularly for women, who were considered immodest for advertising themselves so publicly. But they also provided genuine opportunities for people who had moved away from their home communities and lacked the social networks through which marriages were traditionally arranged. The reality was that Victorian courtship, regardless of social class, was about managing risk in a society where women had very few options outside of marriage. An unmarried woman from the middle or upper classes faced the prospect of living as a dependent in a relative's household, serving as an unpaid governess to nieces and nephews, tolerated but never quite belonging. An unmarried working-class woman faced poverty, exploitative labor conditions, and constant vulnerability. Marriage offered security, status, and purpose. The cost of that security was surrendering almost all autonomy, all property rights, and all legal identity to one's husband. But for most Victorian women, that cost seemed worth paying compared to the alternatives. The rules governing Victorian courtship, regardless of social class, were so numerous that they generated an entire industry of etiquette manuals and advice books. Publications like Godey's Lady Book, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, and Manners for Men by Mrs. C.E. Humphrey became bestsellers because people were genuinely anxious about making mistakes that could ruin their prospects or their reputations. These books laid out in excruciating detail exactly what one could and couldn't do during courtship. And the list of couldn'ts was substantially longer than the list of coulds. The most fundamental rule, the one that governed nearly every other restriction, was that unmarried men and women could not be alone together under any circumstances. Not in a room with the door closed, not on a walk without a chaperone, not in a carriage unless it was open and they were in public view. This rule wasn't about distrust, though distrust certainly played a role. It was about protecting reputation, specifically the woman's reputation, because the mere appearance of impropriety was as damaging as actual impropriety. If a young woman was seen entering a room alone with a gentleman, even if nothing whatsoever happened, she could be considered compromised, her reputation tarnished, her prospects diminished. The presence of a third party, a chaperone, protected her from both actual impropriety and accusations of impropriety. A strict chaperone never left her charge's side, never allowed any private conversation, and made courtship a miserable exercise in performance under surveillance. Physical contact between courting couples was almost entirely forbidden. A gentleman could not hold a lady's hand, could not touch her arm, could not, certainly not, kiss her or embrace her. The single exception to this rule was both specific and slightly absurd. If a courting couple were walking on an uneven road or rough terrain, the gentleman was permitted to offer his arm to steady the lady and prevent her from stumbling or falling into the mud. This was literally the only acceptable reason for physical contact, and it had to be clearly justified by circumstances. On a smooth, level sidewalk, offering an arm would be presumptuous. On a rutted country lane, it was expected. Young couples became very good at finding routes that happened to include rough patches where an arm could be offered without impropriety. Even looking at each other came with restrictions. While walking together, whether chaperoned or not, a gentleman was expected to keep his attention entirely on his companion. He could not turn his head to look at other women passing by. He could not get distracted by shop windows or street performers. His focus was to belong completely to the lady he was escorting, as a sign of respect and serious intentions. Similarly, a young lady was expected to keep her eyes modestly lowered much of the time, meeting her companion's gaze only briefly and never staring. Extended eye contact was considered bold, even aggressive, suggesting an improper degree of interest or knowledge. Conversation topics were heavily restricted. Anything personal was off limits. A gentleman could not ask a lady about her feelings, her hopes for the future, her opinions on serious subjects, or anything that required her to reveal her inner thoughts. She could not ask him personal questions either. Instead, conversations revolved around safe, neutral topics: the weather, current social events, books that were considered appropriate reading, music, perhaps travel, though discussions of travel had to be carefully managed because a woman who had traveled extensively might be considered too worldly. The goal was to be pleasant without being revealing, to demonstrate good breeding and education without displaying too much knowledge or too many opinions. The restriction on gift-giving was particularly complex. A gentleman could not give expensive or lavish gifts to a lady he was courting because such gifts might be construed as attempts to purchase her affection or compromise her independence. According to Professor Thomas E. Hill, an etiquette expert of the 1870s through 1890s, only 4 types of gifts were appropriate for a gentleman to give: books, flowers, confectionery, and sheet music. These items were considered acceptable because they were relatively inexpensive, consumable or shared with family, and carried no implication of intimacy. Jewelry was absolutely forbidden unless the couple was engaged. Clothing items were scandalous. Personal items like handkerchiefs, which today seem innocuous, were considered too intimate because they touched the body. Women faced even more restrictions around gift-giving. A lady could not give a gentleman any gift whatsoever until he had first given her something. Even then, her reciprocal gift had to be small, inexpensive, and ideally handmade, demonstrating her feminine accomplishments rather than her financial resources. Many etiquette manuals warned women against accepting gifts from gentlemen at all, arguing that accepting a gift created a sense of obligation and might encourage a man to believe his affections were returned even if they weren't. The advice was often to politely refuse gifts entirely, which must have made for some awkward moments when a gentleman presented flowers or confectionery only to have them rejected for propriety's sake. Even the use of names was regulated. A woman could not call a gentleman by his first name unless they were engaged or closely related. She was expected to address him by his surname, Mr. Smith or Mr. Brown, as befitted his status as a gentleman.
He, likewise, would address her as Miss Smith or Miss Brown, never by her first name, regardless of how long they'd been acquainted or how much he wished to marry her. This formality created a strange distance even in relationships that were progressing toward marriage. People who intended to spend their entire lives together maintained a linguistic barrier that prevented real intimacy or familiarity. All of these rules were enforced not by written law, but by social pressure. Breaking them resulted in gossip, social exclusion, damaged reputation, and reduced marriage prospects. The more egregious the violation, the more severe the consequences. A young woman seen alone with a man, even her own fiancé, might be considered fast and indiscreet. A young woman who allowed any sort of physical intimacy before marriage would be considered ruined, her reputation permanently destroyed, her marriage prospects demolished. Men faced far fewer consequences for breaking rules, a double standard that permeated every aspect of Victorian courtship and marriage, but even men had to maintain some degree of propriety if they wanted to be accepted in respectable society. Given all these restrictions, how did Victorian couples actually communicate genuine feelings? How did they move beyond stilted pleasantries to something resembling emotional connection? The answer is that they developed secret languages, subtle signals, and creative workarounds that allowed them to express what words and actions were forbidden to reveal. Victorian courtship, beneath its rigid surface, was surprisingly inventive, even subversive, as young people found ways to convey meaning within and around the official rules.
The language of fans became one of the most famous and elaborate forms of covert communication. Fans were practical accessories. Women carried them to every social event for the very real purpose of staying cool in crowded, overheated ballrooms. But they also became instruments of flirtation and signaling. A woman could send multiple messages through how she held, moved, and positioned her fan. Drawing the fan across the cheek might mean, "I love you." Touching the fan to the right cheek meant yes. Touching it to the left cheek meant no. Carrying the fan in the right hand meant you are too willing. Carrying it in the left hand meant I wish to be acquainted. Dropping the fan meant we will be friends. Opening the fan wide meant wait for me. Closing it meant I wish to speak to you. And so on through dozens of possible gestures, each one carrying specific meaning to those who knew the code. The reality of fan language was probably less systematic than popular mythology suggests. Not everyone knew all the signals, and regional variations existed. But the very idea of fan language reveals something important. Victorian couples wanted to communicate more than they were allowed to express directly, and they found creative ways to do so. A woman who drew her fan across her cheek at a ball might be sending a signal, or she might just be hot. The ambiguity was part of the appeal. Plausible deniability meant she could take a risk without technically breaking any rules. Floriography, the language of flowers, was another elaborate communication system. Every flower carried symbolic meaning, and bouquets could be carefully arranged to convey complex messages. Red roses represented deep love and passion, though they were considered rather bold for early courtship. Pink roses meant grace and gentility, a safer choice. White roses symbolized innocence and purity. Violets meant faithfulness and modesty. Forget-me-nots were self-explanatory. Ivy represented fidelity and marriage. Yellow roses suggested friendship rather than romantic love. And some flowers carried warning messages. Yellow carnations meant disappointment, and striped carnations meant refusal. Receiving a bouquet from a gentleman was like receiving a coded love letter. The recipient would examine the arrangement, note which flowers predominated, and consider what message was being sent. A thoughtful suitor could express devotion, declare intentions, or hint at hopes for the future, all through careful flower selection. Women could respond by wearing certain flowers in their hair or attaching them to their clothing, signaling their reception of the message. The language of flowers allowed for emotional expression that direct speech prohibited, though, like fan language, it also allowed for misunderstandings, misinterpretations, and occasionally missed signals when the intended recipient didn't recognize the symbolic meanings. Calling cards became another tool for subtle communication. The official purpose of calling cards was purely practical. A gentleman would leave his card to indicate he'd paid a call or wished to do so. But creative suitors found ways to convey more information. The corner of the card that was turned down might indicate a specific meaning. The exact placement of the card on the silver tray in the entrance hall could signal intentions. And some bold individuals would write brief messages on the back of their cards, messages that would theoretically be read by the lady herself rather than passed through the chaperone. These clandestine cards allowed for slightly more personal communication, though getting caught writing or passing secret messages could result in scandal. Love letters were perhaps the most important form of genuine communication between courting couples. Letters were considered sacred and private. Even family members were not supposed to read another person's letters without permission. This meant that once a courtship had progressed to the stage where correspondence was permitted, young people could write to each other with considerably more honesty and intimacy than they could speak face to face. Love letters allowed for the expression of feelings, hopes, fears, and dreams that would be impossible to voice during a chaperoned visit. There were, of course, guidebooks for writing love letters. Publications like The Dictionary of Love and The Art of Good Behavior offered templates and advice for those uncertain how to express affection in writing. But many young Victorians poured genuine emotion into their letters, creating the kind of intimacy that the courtship rituals specifically prevented. Letters became love, declarations of devotion, confessions of longing, all things that would be scandalously inappropriate to say aloud, but were somehow acceptable when committed to paper and sent through the post. The letter-writing phase of courtship was crucial for another reason. It allowed couples to develop emotional intimacy before marriage. Many Victorian marriages began with couples who barely knew each other, who had only met in formal, supervised settings where genuine conversation was impossible. But if they'd exchanged letters, if they'd spent months or even years writing to each other during a long engagement, they might actually know something about each other's personalities, values, and inner lives. Some historians argue that the Victorian emphasis on letter writing actually created more emotionally intimate marriages than the previous era's focus on face-to-face courtship, because writing forced people to articulate feelings they might never speak aloud.
Of course, the privacy of letters also created risks. A woman who wrote too passionately might reveal inappropriate levels of emotion. Letters could be misdelivered or intercepted. And if an engagement was broken off, letters became evidence that could be used against their writer. Breach of promise suits, where a woman sued a man for breaking an engagement, often included letters as evidence of his intentions. Reading these letters in court must have been mortifying, having one's private feelings exposed to public scrutiny. But it was sometimes necessary to prove that a genuine engagement had existed.
Once a courtship had progressed to the point where families approved and both parties seemed genuinely interested, actual engagement could be considered. But even getting engaged followed specific rules and procedures. A gentleman could not simply propose to a young lady on impulse or even after a heartfelt conversation. First, he had to obtain permission from her father or male guardian. This was not a formality. The father's permission was essential, and fathers took their gatekeeping role seriously. When approaching a father for permission to propose, a young man had to be prepared to discuss his financial situation in detail. What was his annual income? What were his prospects for advancement? Did he own property? Was he in debt? Could he support a wife at the level to which she was accustomed? These were not impolite questions. They were essential practical matters. A father who allowed his daughter to marry a man without adequate means was shirking his duty to protect her welfare. Marriage contracts were being negotiated here, and while romantic feelings might be mentioned, economic security was paramount. If the father approved, the gentleman could then formally propose to the young lady. The proposal itself was expected to be a serious, dignified affair. The gentleman would request a private conversation, though private in this context still meant in the family home with others nearby. He would express his affection, outline his prospects, and ask for her hand in marriage. She was free to accept or refuse, at least in theory. In practice, considerable pressure often existed to accept if the match was considered suitable. Refusing a good offer might mean never receiving another one. Accepting a less than ideal offer might mean financial security, even if emotional fulfillment remained uncertain. An interesting detail: Victorian etiquette held that a gentleman should propose only once. If refused, he was not supposed to ask again. This was considered harassment and inappropriate pressure on the lady. Of course, many men did propose multiple times, and many women gave in to repeated requests. But the official rule was one proposal and then respectful acceptance of the answer given. Women, needless to say, were never supposed to propose under any circumstances. Suggesting marriage was a male prerogative, and a woman who hinted too strongly at her desire for a proposal was considered forward and unladylike. Once a proposal was accepted by both the young woman and her father, the engagement was announced. For upper-class families, this might mean a large party or a notice in the newspaper. For middle-class families, it might be a gathering of relatives and close friends. The announcement made the engagement official and binding, at least socially, if not legally. Breaking an engagement after it had been publicly announced was possible, but brought significant shame and social consequences, particularly for women. Engagements varied dramatically in length, depending on social class and financial circumstances. Upper-class couples with secure finances might marry within a few months of engagement. Middle-class couples often faced engagements of a year or more as the groom established himself financially. Working-class couples sometimes endured engagements lasting several years while both parties saved money to set up a household. These long engagements tested commitment and fidelity, particularly when the couple lived in different areas and saw each other rarely. During the engagement period, couples were granted slightly more freedom than during courtship, but still far less than modern sensibilities would expect. Engaged couples could take walks together without a chaperone, though long walks in secluded areas were still frowned upon. They could hold hands in public, though more intimate physical contact remained forbidden. They could sit together in a parlor without constant supervision, though the gentleman was expected to leave before dark. They could exchange more personal gifts, with jewelry finally becoming acceptable, since it signified a committed relationship. But even engaged couples could not be intimate physically. Sexual relations before marriage were absolutely forbidden, and the consequences for breaking this rule were severe. A woman who became pregnant while engaged might still marry her fiancé, but everyone would know, and the shame would follow her. A woman who became pregnant and then abandoned by her fiancé faced complete ruin. The engagement period was about demonstrating to family and society that both parties could maintain propriety even when they had greater freedom, proving that they were ready for the responsibilities of marriage. Breaking an engagement was possible, but complicated. If the woman broke the engagement, she generally faced more social censure than the man would, because women were supposed to be constant and faithful. If the man broke the engagement, the woman could potentially sue him for breach of promise, seeking financial compensation for the damage to her reputation and prospects. These lawsuits were relatively common in the Victorian era and could result in substantial damages being awarded, particularly if the woman could prove that the man had promised marriage in writing, or that she'd rejected other offers based on his commitment. Wedding planning during the engagement followed predictable patterns. Upper and middle-class families might plan elaborate church ceremonies, though these were nowhere near as extravagant as modern weddings. Queen Victoria's choice to wear white when she married Prince Albert in 1840 started a trend that eventually became tradition. But through much of the Victorian era, brides wore their best dress, regardless of color, choosing something that could be worn again for Sunday services or social occasions. Working-class brides typically wore their Sunday best, whatever that might be. The wedding ceremony itself was fairly standard across classes, following the Book of Common Prayer liturgy. What varied was the reception. Upper-class families might host substantial celebrations. Middle-class families would have modest gatherings. Working-class families might have nothing more than a brief meal with close family. Honeymoons were similarly variable. Wealthy couples might travel to the continent. Middle-class couples might visit friends and relatives in the countryside. Working-class couples might take a single day's trip to the seaside if they could afford even that. Throughout the engagement, both families were preparing for the marriage in practical ways. Dowries were being negotiated if applicable, though by the late Victorian era, dowries were becoming less common except among the wealthy. Household furnishings were being assembled. Living arrangements were being determined. All the practical details of setting up a household were being worked out while the engaged couple navigated the peculiar state of being committed but not yet united. Victorian courtship generated an enormous amount of written advice because anxiety ran high. For a topic as emotionally fraught and socially consequential as finding a spouse, it's not surprising that people sought guidance. What is surprising, or perhaps amusing, is some of the specific advice that books and periodicals offered. Advice for women often focused on appearance and deportment, but it went beyond simple instructions to be neat and pleasant. One guidebook advised that men seeking wives should look for women with large, bulbous heads because they were supposedly bound to be well-sexed and full of pluck. Another recommended choosing a woman with a full bust, good round limbs, and a good, large, well-proportioned head, one who could run and walk and lift a good load. These recommendations read more like advice for selecting a draft horse than a life partner, but they were presented seriously as guidance for identifying desirable physical traits. Women received equally strange counsel. Books like Maiden, Prepare to Become a Happy Wife and Mother by Henry Butter offered instruction on everything from managing a household to maintaining a pleasant demeanor regardless of circumstances. Advice to Single Women by Haydn Brown warned against accepting gifts from men, avoid gossip, decline assistance getting in and out of carriages, never borrow money from a gentleman, and never squeeze into tight spaces with men. The underlying message was clear: maintain maximum distance and minimum contact until marriage made intimacy permissible. Some advice was more emotionally focused. Books cautioned men that the idea of sex was abhorrent to women, and that men should not affront a woman's virtue by making her the football of his lust. This advice reflected the Victorian ideology that respectable women had no sexual desires of their own and endured marital relations purely as a duty. The reality, of course, was far more complex, but publicly acknowledging female sexuality was unthinkable. Advice books also counseled young women on how to evaluate potential husbands. They were told to observe a suitor's behavior toward his own family, particularly his mother and sisters, because how he treated them would predict how he'd treat his wife. They were advised to watch how he conducted himself around other young women, looking for signs of fickleness or disrespect. They were instructed to inquire discreetly about. Throughout the engagement, both families were preparing for the marriage in practical ways. Dowries were being negotiated if applicable, though by the late Victorian era, dowries were becoming less common except among the wealthy. Household furnishings were being assembled. Living arrangements were being determined. All the practical details of setting up a household were being worked out while the engaged couple navigated the peculiar state of being committed but not yet united. Victorian courtship generated an enormous amount of written advice because anxiety ran high. For a topic as emotionally fraught and socially consequential as finding a spouse, it's not surprising that people sought guidance. What is surprising, or perhaps amusing, is some of the specific advice that books and periodicals offered. Advice for women often focused on appearance and deportment, but it went beyond simple instructions to be neat and pleasant. One guidebook advised that men seeking wives should look for women with large, bulbous heads because they were supposedly bound to be well-sexed and full of pluck. Another recommended choosing a woman with a full bust, good round limbs, and a good, large, well-proportioned head, one who could run and walk and lift a good load. These recommendations read more like advice for selecting a draft horse than a life partner, but they were presented seriously as guidance for identifying desirable physical traits. Women received equally strange counsel. Books like Maiden, Prepare to Become a Happy Wife and Mother by Henry Butter offered instruction on everything from managing a household to maintaining a pleasant demeanor regardless of circumstances. Advice to Single Women by Hayden Brown warned against accepting gifts from men, avoid gossip, decline assistance getting in and out of carriages, never borrow money from a gentleman, and never squeeze into tight spaces with men. The underlying message was clear: maintain maximum distance and minimum contact until marriage made intimacy permissible. Some advice was more emotionally focused. Books cautioned men that the idea of sex was abhorrent to women, and that men should not affront a woman's virtue by making her the football of his lust. This advice reflected the Victorian ideology that respectable women had no sexual desires of their own and endured marital relations purely as a duty. The reality, of course, was far more complex, but publicly acknowledging female sexuality was unthinkable. Advice books also counseled young women on how to evaluate potential husbands. They were told to observe a suitor's behavior toward his own family, particularly his mother and sisters, because how he treated them would predict how he'd treat his wife. They were advised to watch how he conducted himself around other young women, looking for signs of fickleness or disrespect. They were instructed to inquire discreetly about his habits, particularly regarding drinking and gambling, because a man with vicious habits would make a miserable husband. Financial stability was emphasized repeatedly. Love was all well and good, but a woman needed a husband who could provide. Men received advice about evaluating women's domestic capabilities. Could she sew? Could she manage household accounts? Did she have a pleasing disposition? Was she healthy and strong enough to bear children and manage a household? These questions might seem mercenary, but they reflected the practical realities of marriage. A wife's role was to manage the domestic sphere, bear and raise children, and support her husband's work. Her ability to fulfill these functions mattered enormously to family prosperity and social standing. Some advice was surprisingly progressive for the era. A few guidebooks encouraged couples to seek companionship and emotional connection rather than purely practical arrangements. The concept of the companionate marriage, where spouses were partners and friends rather than just economic units, gained traction during the Victorian era. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were held up as the ideal, a couple who seemed to genuinely love each other, supported each other, and built a true partnership. Their very public relationship influenced social ideals, encouraging people to hope for and seek emotional intimacy alongside economic security. Books also emerged specifically about writing love letters, recognizing that this was where much of Victorian courtship actually happened. These books offered templates and examples,
showing how to express affection appropriately. Too much passion was vulgar. Too little warmth seemed cold. The goal was to strike a balance, demonstrating sincere affection while maintaining propriety. Letters were supposed to be romantic without being explicit, devoted without being desperate, personal without being too revealing. What's striking about Victorian advice literature is its underlying anxiety. All these rules, all these guidelines, all this desperate seeking for proper behavior reveals a society deeply uncertain about how to manage the transition from childhood to marriage, from family of origin to family of creation. The rigid rules provided structure and guidance in a realm where
the rationale for these restrictions was partly practical. Employers didn't want pregnant servants, and partly about maintaining social distance. A servant who formed an attachment to a man, particularly a man from a slightly higher social class, might become distracted from her duties, might demand more time off, might ultimately leave service to marry. From the employer's perspective, restricting followers protected both the household's smooth operation and the servant's own welfare by preventing her from forming inappropriate attachments. For servants who were permitted followers, courtship happened in public spaces on precious afternoons off. A young woman might walk in the park with a suitor, attend church together, or visit a tea shop if they could afford it. These outings were brief and infrequent, but they were all the time the couple had to determine if they wanted to commit to each other. The relationship developed slowly, over months or years, through weekly meetings and occasional letters. Young women working in factories or shops had more freedom, but different challenges. They worked long hours, often 6 days a week, leaving little time for social life. They might meet young men at work, though many factories and shops discouraged or forbade socializing between male and female employees. They might meet at church, one of the few respectable places where working-class young people of both sexes gathered. Or they might meet at pubs or music halls, venues that were considered less respectable, but offered more opportunities for interaction. Without parental supervision, since many working-class young people had left home for work, courting couples had to navigate risks that middle-class women with chaperones didn't face. Men might pressure women for physical intimacy, arguing that it proved affection or commitment. Women had to judge whether a man's promises to marry were genuine, or whether he'd abandon her once he got what he wanted. The consequences of misjudgment were severe. A working-class woman who became pregnant outside marriage lost her job, her housing if she lived in, and any hope of respectable employment. She might turn to prostitution simply to survive, or she might end up in the workhouse, the dreaded last resort for the destitute. Working-class courtships were also more likely to be cut short by circumstances beyond the couple's control. Men might lose their jobs and have to move to find work elsewhere. Women might be dismissed from their positions and forced to leave the area. Economic downturns could make marriage impossible for years as couples struggled just to survive individually, let alone together. Illness or injury could destroy a young man's ability to work and thus his ability to support a wife, ending engagements that had seemed solid. Working-class couples also sometimes formed genuine partnerships based on mutual affection and shared struggle. Without the pretense and performance that characterized upper-class courtship, without the economic strategizing that dominated middle-class matches, some working-class couples actually got to know each other as people. They saw each other at their worst, tired from work, dressed plainly, without the polish of social performance. If they chose to marry despite knowing the reality of each other's circumstances, that choice might have been more honest than marriages arranged in drawing rooms. Matrimonial advertisements offered an alternative path, particularly for working-class people who had migrated to cities and lacked the social networks through which marriages were traditionally arranged. These ads, published in newspapers and periodicals, were straightforward in their practicality. A 25-year-old shopkeeper seeking a respectable woman with domestic skills. A 23-year-old needlewoman seeking a steady man with prospects. The ads specified age, occupation, sometimes religion, and what was sought in a partner. They were transactional, certainly, but they were also honest about what marriage was, an economic and social arrangement. Women who placed matrimonial advertisements faced more stigma than men, because advertising oneself was considered immodest and aggressive. A respectable woman was supposed to wait to be chosen, not actively market herself. But for women who were isolated, who had moved away from home for work, who were getting older and seeing their marketability decline, taking action might seem worth the social risk. And despite the stigma, matrimonial advertisements did result in marriages, some of which were apparently successful. What united working-class courtship across its various forms was the lack of pretense. These were people seeking partners to face life struggles alongside, not seeking to perform respectability or maintain social standing. The absence of chaperones and elaborate rules didn't mean absence of morality or care. It meant navigating courtship with fewer protections and more direct consequences, making choices based on immediate realities rather than social expectations. Of all the forces shaping Victorian courtship, perhaps none was more powerful or more destructive than the threat of scandal and social ruin. The Victorian obsession with respectability created a climate where reputation mattered more than almost anything else. And a damaged reputation, particularly for women, could be utterly devastating. The concept of the fallen woman haunted Victorian society, a specter of what happened to those who violated sexual norms or even appeared to violate them. A fallen woman could be many things. A woman who had engaged in sexual activity outside of marriage, whether voluntarily or through rape. A woman who had been seduced and abandoned. A woman who had borne a child out of wedlock. A woman who had committed adultery. Even a woman who had merely been accused of any of these things without proof. Once labeled as fallen, a woman faced complete social exclusion. Doors closed to her. Former friends refused to acknowledge her. Family members might disown her entirely. Employment became nearly impossible to find, especially employment in respectable households. Marriage prospects vanished entirely, because what man would marry a ruined woman? The term itself, fallen, reveals the ideology behind the condemnation. Women were supposed to exist on a moral pedestal, pure and untouched, above the sordid reality of sexual desire. To fall was to plummet from that pedestal into degradation from which there was no return. Once fallen, a woman could never climb back up. She was permanently stained, permanently ruined, permanently outcast. Victorian art and literature are filled with images and stories of fallen women, and they almost invariably end in death, either through suicide or illness or violence. The message was clear. There was no redemption, no second chance, no path forward for a woman who had lost her virtue. What made this particularly cruel was the extreme disparity in how sexual transgression was judged based on gender. A man who had affairs, who visited prostitutes, who seduced servants or working-class women faced minimal social consequences, if any. Such behavior was considered regrettable, perhaps, but ultimately understandable, even natural. Boys will be boys, the saying went, acknowledging and implicitly excusing male sexual behavior. A married man who kept a mistress might face disapproval from his wife, but would not be socially shunned. An unmarried man who frequented brothels would not have his marriage prospects diminished. But a woman who engaged in any sexual activity outside marriage was ruined, her prospects destroyed, her reputation irreparable. Even a woman who had been raped was often blamed for her assault. She must have encouraged him. She must have been in the wrong place. She must have worn something provocative. She must have failed to resist vigorously enough. Victorian ideology held that respectable women had no sexual desires and would resist any sexual advance with every fiber of their being. If assault occurred, the woman must have somehow invited or permitted it, making her complicit in her own ruin. The fear of scandal shaped every aspect of courtship behavior. Young women were so carefully supervised precisely because any appearance of impropriety could destroy them. Being alone with a man, even briefly, even innocently, could generate gossip that would follow a woman for years. A woman seen entering a hotel or private residence with a man not her husband or father would be assumed to be engaging in sexual activity, regardless of actual circumstances. A woman who stayed out late unchaperoned, who traveled alone, who dressed too boldly or behaved too freely, courted suspicion that could blossom into scandal. Blackmail thrived in this environment. People who possessed information about sexual indiscretions or who claimed to possess such information could extort enormous sums from their victims, particularly female victims who faced complete social destruction if their secrets were revealed. Sherlock Holmes stories frequently featured blackmailers threatening to expose letters or meetings that would ruin reputations. These stories resonated with Victorian readers because everyone understood how devastating such exposure could be. Real-world scandals provide insight into the mechanisms and consequences of social ruin. When Lady Harriet Mordaunt confessed to her husband that she had been unfaithful, hoping perhaps for understanding, her confession led instead to a sensational divorce case. She was declared insane, not because she showed symptoms of mental illness, but because Victorian society found it more acceptable to label an adulterous woman as mad than to accept that a woman of her social position would willingly engage in extramarital affairs. She was eventually committed to an asylum and lived there for decades, removed from society and from her children. Her life effectively ended by her sexual transgression. The case of W.T. Stead and the Eliza Armstrong scandal reveals another dimension of Victorian attitudes toward sexual morality. Stead, a journalist, purchased a 13-year-old girl from her mother and wrote articles exposing how easily children could be procured for prostitution. His article shocked the nation and helped pass legislation raising the age of consent. But Stead was also prosecuted and imprisoned because he had technically participated in procuring a child, even though his intention was to expose the practice. The scandal revealed both Victorian outrage at child sexual exploitation and Victorian unwillingness to fundamentally challenge the conditions that allowed such exploitation to flourish. Women who became pregnant outside marriage faced the most immediate and devastating consequences. An upper-class woman might be sent away to have the baby quietly, perhaps to a relative in the country or to Europe, returning months later with the child having been given up for adoption and a story concocted about illness or travel. She might then re-enter society with her reputation bruised but potentially salvageable, particularly if she married quickly afterward. But everyone would know, or would suspect, and her value on the marriage market would be permanently diminished. Women who became pregnant outside marriage faced the most immediate and devastating consequences. An upper-class woman might be sent away to have the baby quietly, perhaps to a relative in the country or to Europe, returning months later with the child having been given up for adoption and a story concocted about illness or travel. She might then re-enter society with her reputation bruised but potentially salvageable, particularly if she married quickly afterward. But everyone would know, or would suspect, and her value on the marriage market would be permanently diminished. Women who became pregnant outside marriage faced the most immediate and devastating consequences. An upper-class woman might be sent away to have the baby quietly, perhaps to a relative in the country or to Europe, returning months later with the child having been given up for adoption and a story concocted about illness or travel. She might then re-enter society with her reputation bruised but potentially salvageable, particularly if she married quickly afterward. But everyone would know, or would suspect, and her value on the marriage market would be permanently diminished. Women who became pregnant outside marriage faced the most immediate and devastating consequences. An upper-class woman might be sent away to have the baby quietly, perhaps to a relative in the country or to Europe, returning months later with the child having been given up for adoption and a story concocted about illness or travel. She might then re-enter society. A middle-class woman who became pregnant outside marriage had fewer options for concealment and faced more severe consequences. She would likely be cast out of her family home. Her employment prospects would vanish. She might end up in a charity home for unwed mothers, essentially a workhouse where she would labor throughout her pregnancy and after, sometimes for years, to pay for her room and board. Her child would likely be taken from her and placed in an orphanage or given to adoptive parents. She would leave the home with no references, no savings, and a past that made respectable employment impossible to obtain. A working-class woman who became pregnant outside marriage faced complete destitution. Dismissed from her job, evicted from her lodgings, unable to find other work, she had few options. Some turned to their families, if their families would take them in, often facing abuse and condemnation. Some ended up in workhouses, laboring in grim conditions while pregnant and then for years afterward to repay the cost of their care. Some turned to prostitution as the only way to survive. And some simply died, from complications of childbirth, from disease, from suicide, from the cumulative effects of poverty and despair. Victorian society did develop some charity responses to fallen women, though these were often as punishing as they were helpful. Penitentiaries for fallen women operated as a combination of refuge and prison, where women would live and work for months or years, receiving moral instruction intended to reform their characters. The assumption was that these women had fallen due to moral weakness and needed to be trained into proper behavior. The conditions were often harsh, the work was grueling, and the stigma of having been in a penitentiary followed women even after they left. What's notable is that Victorian society, for all its public condemnation of fallen women, was also obsessed with them. Novels about seduced governesses and ruined young women were bestsellers. Paintings depicting fallen women were popular and provocative. The figure of the prostitute haunted Victorian art and literature as both object of pity and subject of fascination. This obsession reveals the hypocrisy at the heart of Victorian sexual morality, publicly condemning what privately titillated, creating the conditions for sexual exploitation while publicly mourning its victims. The scandal and ruin narratives also served social control functions. By making the consequences of sexual transgression so severe and so public, Victorian society attempted to regulate female sexuality through fear. The message to young women was clear: remain pure, remain chaste, follow the rules, because any deviation leads to total destruction. No second chances, no forgiveness, no path back to respectability. The threat of scandal kept women compliant, kept them monitored, kept them dependent on male protection and family approval, because venturing outside those protections meant risking everything. Victorian gender ideology shaped every aspect of courtship, marriage, and daily life, creating a system of expectations and restrictions that benefited men while constraining women at every turn. Understanding these gender expectations is essential to understanding why Victorian courtship operated as it did, because the rules weren't arbitrary. They flowed directly from deeply held beliefs about male and female nature, capabilities, and proper rules. The dominant ideology held that men and women were fundamentally different creatures, not just physically, but intellectually, emotionally, and morally. Men were seen as naturally aggressive, rational, strong, sexual, and suited for public life, business, and politics. Women were seen as naturally passive, emotional, weak, asexual, or asexual, or at least lacking in sexual desire, and suited exclusively for domestic life, childcare, and moral guardianship of the home. These weren't considered social constructions or learned behaviors. They were believed to be biological facts, natural laws that no amount of social change could alter. This ideology of separate spheres meant that men and women inhabited fundamentally different worlds. The male sphere was the public world of work, commerce, politics, and social interaction. The female sphere was the private world of home, family, children, and domestic management. These spheres were supposed to be separate but complementary, each sex fulfilling its natural role in perfect harmony. The reality, of course, was that the male sphere had all the power, money, legal rights, and social freedom, while the female sphere was a gilded cage whose bars were disguised as protection. Women were taught from childhood that their purpose in life was to marry, bear children, and manage a household. Education for middle and upper-class girls focused on accomplishments that would make them attractive wives. Music, drawing, languages, fancy needlework, and enough literature and history to make polite conversation, but not enough to develop dangerous independent thinking. Girls were not generally educated in mathematics, sciences, philosophy, or anything that might lead them to question their prescribed roles. Working-class girls received even less education, often only basic literacy, if that, because they needed to work to survive and would have no leisure for intellectual pursuits. The ideal Victorian woman, famously described in the poem The Angel in the House, was selfless, pure, devoted, patient, and completely absorbed in serving her husband and children. She was supposed to find her entire fulfillment in domestic duties and maternal love, never expressing dissatisfaction, ambition for anything beyond the home, or any desires of her own that conflicted with her family's needs. The angel in the house had no sexuality, no anger, no selfishness, no ambition. She existed only to make others comfortable and happy. This impossible standard created enormous pressure on actual women who, being human, possessed desires, frustrations, ambitions, and sexuality. The gap between the ideal and the reality had to be concealed, creating a culture of performance where women constantly monitored themselves and each other to maintain the appearance of perfect feminine virtue. A woman who expressed anger was unwomanly. A woman who pursued intellectual interests was odd and potentially unmarriable. A woman who showed sexual desire was depraved. So women learned to suppress, conceal, and deny aspects of themselves that didn't fit the prescribed model. Men, meanwhile, were granted enormous latitude in their behavior. Male sexuality was acknowledged and accepted, even celebrated. A man who had affairs before marriage was sowing wild oats. A man who visited prostitutes was indulging natural urges. A married man who kept a mistress was simply being male. None of this affected his reputation or social standing in any meaningful way. Men were expected to be sexual beings, and their sexual behavior was their own concern, as long as it didn't cause public scandal. This sexual double standard extended into marriage. Husbands were legally entitled to sexual access to their wives whenever they wished. The concept of marital rape didn't exist in Victorian law because marriage meant that a woman had consented to all future sexual relations with her husband by virtue of saying yes at the altar. A wife had no legal right to refuse her husband, and a husband who forced himself on his wife was not committing any crime. Meanwhile, a wife who committed adultery was committing both a moral sin and a legal offense, grounds for divorce and complete loss of her children and property. Women's legal status after marriage was profoundly unequal. Under the doctrine of coverture, which remained the law in England through much of the Victorian era, a married woman had no legal identity separate from her husband. She could not own property in her own name. She could not sign contracts. She could not sue or be sued. Any wages she earned belonged to her husband. Any property she brought into the marriage became his. She had no legal rights to her own children, who were legally the father's property. If a marriage ended in separation, the husband retained custody and the wife might be barred from ever seeing her children again. These legal realities meant that women entered marriage from a position of total economic and legal dependence. They were literally putting their entire lives and futures into their husbands' hands, hoping that the men they barely knew would turn out to be kind, responsible, and faithful. Many women did end up in happy marriages, or at least acceptable ones. But many others found themselves trapped with abusive, unfaithful, or financially irresponsible husbands and had no legal recourse whatsoever. Divorce was theoretically possible, but practically very difficult and expensive. Before 1857, divorce required a private act of Parliament and cost hundreds of pounds, putting it out of reach for all but the wealthiest families. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 made divorce slightly more accessible by creating divorce courts, but the grounds for divorce remained deeply unequal. A man could divorce his wife for adultery alone. A woman could divorce her husband only if his adultery was combined with another offense, like cruelty, bigamy, incest, or desertion. Simple adultery by the husband was not grounds for divorce, reflecting the social acceptance of male infidelity. Even women who successfully divorced faced social stigma and economic hardship. A divorced woman was socially suspect, often excluded from respectable society. She might lose custody of her children. She had limited ability to support herself because respectable employment for women was scarce and poorly paid. Many divorced women ended up living on the margins of society, dependent on relatives or struggling to survive on meager incomes from needlework or teaching. The gender expectations extended into every aspect of daily life during courtship. Women were supposed to be passive, waiting to be chosen rather than actively seeking partners. A woman who showed too much interest in a man was forward and unladylike. A woman who flirted openly was immodest. A woman who encouraged multiple suitors was a coquette. Women had to walk a careful line between being attractive enough to generate interest and modest enough to maintain respectability. Women were taught to see marriage as their only possible future and to fear spinsterhood as a fate worse than death. An unmarried woman had no real place in Victorian society. She was a failure, a burden, an object of pity. The desperation to marry any acceptable man rather than no man at all shaped women's behavior during courtship. They couldn't afford to be too picky, too demanding, or too honest about their own needs and desires because doing so might cost them their only chance at security and social acceptability. Men faced less pressure to marry, but still felt societal expectations. A man who remained unmarried too long might be suspected of irregular habits or insufficient masculinity. Marriage was seen as a stabilizing force for men, a sign of responsibility and adulthood. But men could delay marriage until they were financially secure, which might mean marrying in their 30s or even 40s to women in their late teens or early 20s, creating marriages between people at very different life stages with very different levels of power and experience. The Victorian wedding ceremony itself enshrined these gender inequalities. The bride was given away by her father, literally transferred from one man's protection to another's. She promised to love, honor, and obey her husband. He promised to love and cherish her, but not to obey. The language and ritual of the ceremony made clear that this was not a union of equals, but a hierarchical relationship with the husband as head and the wife as subordinate. After marriage, the gender expectations continued to shape daily life. A wife's role was to manage the household, whether that meant directly doing all the cooking and cleaning in a working-class home, or supervising servants in a middle or upper-class household. She was responsible for child-rearing, including discipline and education of young children. She was expected to create a peaceful, comfortable home environment where her husband could relax after his day in the public sphere. She was supposed to be cheerful, accommodating, and endlessly patient, regardless of her own feelings or fatigue. A husband's role was to provide financially and to represent the family in the public sphere. He made all major decisions about finances, residences, and children's futures. He controlled all property and income. He was the head of the household in every meaningful sense. His comfort, his preferences, and his work took priority over anyone else's needs. A good husband was expected to be kind to his wife and generous with his resources, but he was under no obligation to be so. A bad husband could be tyrannical, violent, unfaithful, or financially irresponsible, and his wife had limited ability to change or escape the situation. Victorian gender ideology was not monolithic, and it did evolve over the course of the era. By the later Victorian period, women's rights movements were gaining strength, challenging coverture laws, fighting for property rights, demanding access to education and professions, and eventually demanding the vote. The new woman emerged as a concept and a reality. Women who pursued education, careers, and independence rather than accepting marriage as their only option. But these changes came slowly and faced fierce resistance from those who saw them as threatening the natural order of society. The wedding itself was the culmination of all the months or years of courtship, the moment when all the rules and restrictions finally gave way to legal union and the permission for intimacy. But even weddings followed strict class-based patterns and social expectations that shaped how the day unfolded and what it meant for the couple's future. Queen Victoria's wedding to Prince Albert in 1840 created a template that would influence wedding traditions for generations. She wore white, a color that previously had no special wedding significance, but became synonymous with bridal purity and innocence after Victoria popularized it. She wore a veil and orange blossoms, both of which became standard bridal attire. and she created the model of the white wedding as a romantic, sentimental occasion focused on the bride's beauty and the couple's love, rather than simply a legal contract signing. But Victoria was royalty, and royal weddings bore little resemblance to what ordinary people experienced. For the upper classes, weddings could be grand affairs held in notable churches with hundreds of guests, elaborate receptions, and extensive celebrations. But even these weren't the massive productions that modern wealthy weddings have become. Victorian upper-class weddings were relatively restrained by contemporary standards, perhaps 100 guests, a church service, a wedding breakfast afterward, and then the couple departing on their honeymoon while guests continued celebrating. Middle-class weddings were more modest affairs. The ceremony would be held at the family's regular church, attended by family and close friends. The bride wore her best dress, which might be white if the family could afford a dress that would be worn only once, but was often a good dress in another color that she could wear again for church and social occasions. A veil was common but not universal. Orange blossoms, either real if available, or wax replicas that could be kept and reused through generations, symbolized chastity and were often worn as a coronet or attached to the dress. The wedding ceremony followed standard Anglican liturgy, with the bride and groom exchanging vows before God and witnesses. The language emphasized the permanence and seriousness of marriage. This is not to be entered into lightly or wantonly, the prayer book warned, but reverently, soberly, and in the fear of God. The bride promised to obey her husband, sealing her subordinate legal status. The groom placed a ring on her finger, though double ring ceremonies where both parties exchanged rings were not yet common. After the ceremony came a wedding breakfast, which, despite the name, was a midday meal served to guests. For wealthy families, this might be an elaborate affair with multiple courses, champagne, and a tiered wedding cake. For middle-class families, it might be a simpler meal served at the family home. For working-class families, it might be nothing more than tea and cake shared among close family members. The key was that the meal served as a public acknowledgement of the marriage and a celebration of the new family unit. Working-class weddings were stripped down to bare essentials. The ceremony might take place at a registry office rather than a church, because registry marriages were cheaper and didn't require church fees. Or if the ceremony was at church, it might be a brief service with only a few witnesses present. The bride wore her Sunday best, whatever she owned that was decent and clean. There was no elaborate dress, no veil, no orange blossoms, unless someone had saved a wax coronet from a previous generation. After the ceremony might be a brief celebration at a pub, drinks bought by the groom and his friends, or the couple might simply return to their lodgings and begin married life immediately. But we should also recognize that the Victorian era wasn't entirely negative in its influence. The Victorian emphasis on companionate marriage, on seeking emotional connection and partnership rather than purely economic arrangements, shaped modern expectations in positive ways. We inherited from the Victorians the idea that marriage should be based on love, that spouses should be friends and companions, that emotional intimacy matters. Before the Victorian era, marriages were much more likely to be purely practical arrangements. The Victorians added romance and relationship to the equation, even if they did so within deeply problematic frameworks. We can also observe that many of the anxieties and challenges of Victorian courtship remain recognizable today, even if the specific rules have changed. People still worry about making good impressions. People still struggle with the gap between public performance and private reality. People still seek love while managing practical considerations like economic security and social approval. People still navigate the complicated dance of revealing enough of themselves to create intimacy, while protecting themselves from rejection and hurt. The rules may be different, but the underlying human experiences are surprisingly similar. It's important not to romanticize the Victorian era, as popular culture often does. Those beautiful dresses came with corsets that damaged internal organs. Those elaborate balls were exercises in social anxiety and strategic positioning. Those romantic letters often concealed desperate economic calculations. The elegant surface of Victorian courtship covered a reality of profound inequality, limited choices, and real human suffering. Women forced into marriages with men they barely knew. Young people separated from those they loved by class barriers or family disapproval. Girls married off to much older men. People trapped in abusive relationships with no escape. We should see the Victorian era clearly, appreciating what was beautiful while acknowledging what was cruel. We might also consider what the Victorian experience teaches us about the relationship between rules and freedom. The Victorians believed their elaborate system of courtship rules protected young people, particularly young women, from harm. And in some ways it did. Chaperoning prevented some coercion and assault. Social consequences for male misbehavior provided some deterrent. Clear expectations helped people navigate unfamiliar social situations. But the rules also prevented genuine connection, constrained authentic self-expression, and trapped people in roles that might not fit their natures or desires. Rules provide security at the cost of freedom. Finding the right balance remains a challenge in every era. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll dream of walking through a Victorian ballroom, watching the dancers glide past in their elaborate costumes, hearing the whisper of fans and the rustle of silk, smelling the mingled scents of perfume and candle wax. But look closer at the faces behind the masks of propriety. See the anxiety in the young woman hoping for a proposal. Notice the calculation in the expression of the mother evaluating potential sons-in-law. Observe the frustration of the young couple whose love is blocked by class difference or family disapproval. Recognize the humanity beneath the historical costume. We've traveled together through the marriage market, through the rigid rules of chaperoned courtship, through the secret languages of fans and flowers, through the economic realities that shaped romantic choices, through the devastating consequences of scandal, through the profound gender inequalities that structured every interaction. We've seen how people fell in love despite restrictions designed to prevent genuine connection. We've observed how they carved out moments of authenticity within systems designed to produce only proper performances. We've recognized that even in a world very different from our own, human desires for love, security, and belonging remain constant. The Victorian era ended more than a century ago. The rules that once governed courtship with such rigidity have largely dissolved. Young people today would find Victorian dating practices bizarre, oppressive, even absurd. And yet the Victorians were our relatively recent ancestors. Their choices and values shaped the world we inherited. Understanding how they lived, how they loved, and how they navigated the elaborate social machinery of their time helps us understand ourselves and our own courtship rituals more clearly. So, if these calm glimpses into the past have helped you drift towards sleep, if you found something interesting or surprising or thought-provoking in this exploration of Victorian dating, I'd love it if you'd like and subscribe to help this channel grow. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is where you are, and whether Victorian courtship seems impossibly restrictive, or whether you think some of those rules might have had their benefits. Your comments and engagement help this channel reach more people who love history delivered in this calm, detailed, sleep-friendly way. Thank you for spending this time wandering through Victorian drawing rooms and ballrooms with me, watching young people navigate the complex, frustrating, occasionally beautiful dance of courtship in an era very different from our own. May you sleep well, dream peacefully, and wake tomorrow with appreciation for the freedoms we have and understanding of the past that shaped our present. Good night.